Let us now move to another example in the form of global value chains. Real value, according to Marx, is produced at the bottom of the value chain, and all other levels of a company, for example, profit from the laborer at the bottom. A company, in the end, relies on the laborer, but this is not reflected in the respective wages. There is a capitalist chain, a hierarchy, if you will, even within companies. Marx viewed capitalism as a world economy from the start, and there is extensive discussion on global value chains and the role of colonies in servicing the production, merchant, and financial capital of the industrializing nations of Marx's time. In this analysis, Marx's political economy connects capitalism with colonial and imperial power. Global value chains apply not only to products and financial capital, but also people. In Marxist terms, many laborers end up working the vast majority of their working day for the benefit of other people, sometimes across the globe. When workers migrate or immigrate internationally to work, this reflects differences in working opportunities and often standards of living. This is the case when you think of relatively cheap immigrant labor, for example, in agriculture, on which most Western countries have become reliant. This offers opportunities for capital to use cheaper labor costs to increase surplus value, more labor time at a lower cost by offshoring or outsourcing production. The ironical hierarchy of manufacture is that the concrete manufacture of, for example, clothes is moved the furthest away from the corporate hub where most of the profits are realized and capital is accumulated. Think, for example, the long value chains of companies like H&M. Global value chains leverage production efficiency, usually in terms of cost, of materials or of labor. Global value chains relate not only to production, but also sales, distribution, and financing, creating a series of interlocking loops. It is possible to visualize this interlocking system through perhaps looking at the Olympic loops, which are different colors for different forms of capital, all revolving against each other, all feeding into one another, but also sometimes causing friction. Especially in global capitalism, financial markets are the necessary oil that lubricate the value chains. Producers need credit to give to manufacturers before they can sell their products to retailers, and retailers need credit to buy products from manufacturers before they can sell them to consumers. While capitalism is vulnerable to shocks in the national context, it is arguably even more so in the global context. The promise of higher capital gains through leveraging global value chains also means susceptibility to problems in the global value chains. We can visualize this by observing services that track, for example, air or sea cargo traffic, as seen in these images. Then the question of this highly logistical value chain always working on the background of the capitalist production system, we have to ask, what could go wrong? Well, here we can see an image of a massive container ship stuck in a narrow waterway, blocking it for all other traffic. This is, of course, the notorious ship Ever Given, belonging to the shipping company Evergreen, which became stuck in the Suez Canal between March 23rd and 29th of 2021. The ship was calculated to hold up $9.6 billion worth of global trade a day. Global value chains enable capital to seek out the labor force with the highest potential of exploitation for surplus value. Marx would argue, and indeed he does in the Communist Manifesto, that free trade as a form of exploitation has merely transplanted more shameless, direct, and brutal forms of exploitation. This exploitation is often out of sight for producers and the beneficiaries of this arrangement of capital accumulation. Marx would also argue that the endemic potential of capitalism to go into contradictory crises cannot be solved by merely expanding the system. The world system of trade does not reduce the crisis potentiality of capitalism, it increases it. Global value chains also allow capitalism to move its crisis around. While problems in a national context would be devastating to capital locally and the state in that country, it is not necessarily so for global capital overall, which can move across borders seamlessly. Capital will defend its right to full mobility so it can continue to leverage the global value chain for the highest rate of exploitation. For Marxist international political economy, the social and economic structures of capitalism are politically linked, normalized, and imposed. The economy dictates how international political systems move by default in exploitative and excluding ways, and above all, it is prone to crisis. While the global value chain can increase production efficiency and give lower costs and expand markets, it also opens up the global system to local crises. A crisis in manufacture can become a crisis in finance and vice versa. Troubled markets can sometimes be even abandoned, as for example in the case of the Asian financial crisis in the late 1990s, or in cases where, for example, new legislation would increase labor costs or new environmental regulation would increase production costs. Large multinational corporations are increasingly mobile, seeking to leverage the global value chain for the highest rate of exploitation, and they are very active political agents. The world economy is increasingly interdependent, which means system shocks can cascade through the system much more rapidly, hitting those territories with the least margins to cope the hardest. Capital accumulation protects against crises, meaning higher precision on the value chain protects capital. While the global value chain can spread some of its wealth and uplift people from poverty, Marxist international political economy emphasizes that the capitalists are always disproportionately advantaged. Economic growth has been made subservient on business confidence to invest. The structural power of capital has moved market discipline from domestic to international forums. Structuring production in favor of the West or the global North in core periphery models have made peripheries subservient to the core to be utilized and discarded at will. Here, cores mean, for example, the wealthiest global North nations, and the periphery are the more developing nations with less capital accumulation and less marginal for resisting capital encroachment. While this has increased the flexibility of production, it also has demolished the bargaining power of Western organized labor. Different parts of the global value chain are subjugated and disciplined to the rules set by capital. Given the fragility of extended chains of production and financing, a certain degree of stability and predictability is expected, or even demanded, in both politics and finance. The global value chain allows multinational companies to shop around for the most favorable manufacturing conditions, meaning cheap and abundant labor, local tax breaks, low levels of regulation, and so on. Thus, national labor regulation can become a dimension of transnational trade competition. From the perspective of Marxist international political economy, the markets should be seen as a political device to achieve certain outcomes. The rules of the market economy have been enforced locally and globally, often through transnational legal rules such as trade agreements. Global trade thus undermines the relatively closed circuit of economic and social policy relating to high labor standards and imposes a heavier burden of social policy than it was designed to bear. In the case of the welfare state, this is especially noticeable. We will talk more of what this has meant to the Nordic welfare states in the next lecture on post-Marxist international political